What if the greatest empire the world has ever known wasn't Rome, wasn't Egypt, wasn't even Atlantis, but a name you were never taught in school? Tartaria. For centuries, its borders stretched across half of Asia, etched boldly on maps by explorers, scholars, and kings. Then, without war, without a fall, its name vanished, erased from atlases, deleted from textbooks, buried beneath mud, fire, and silence as if it had never existed. Imagine an entire civilization wiped from memory, its cities entombed beneath our feet, its technologies scattered like forbidden relics, its people absorbed into history's blind spots. Who had the power to erase a civilization on this scale? And what secret was so dangerous it had to be hidden from the future? Tonight we'll open that locked door in history and step into the forgotten halls of Tartaria. The maps, the myths, the ruins, they are still here, whispering. All we have to do is listen. Picture a map unfolding before you. The parchment is yellowed, edges curled by centuries, yet across its surface stretches a vast dominion, Great Tartary, spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, swallowing Siberia, Central Asia, and northern China into one massive name. On maps drawn by Dutch cartographers in the 1600s, French atlases of the 1700s, even German engravings of the 1800s, Tartaria appears not as an empty wilderness, but as a defined realm, subdivided into Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, independent Tartary. Rival nations agreed on its presence, even if they contested each other on every other detail of the world. Yet as the 19th century ended, Tartaria vanished. One edition of a map shows it boldly, the next omits it entirely, as though a great civilization had been erased with a stroke of ink. What was Tartaria? Historians now insist it was never an empire, merely a catch-all label for nomadic peoples. Turkic tribes, Mongols, Tatars roaming the Eurasian steppe. But this explanation falters when confronted with the consistency and precision of cartographic records. Why so many centuries of maps, drawn by hands scattered across Europe, depict Tartaria with defined borders, capitals, and provinces? If it were just a vague placeholder, why did it persist so long, then disappear so suddenly? Some theorists whisper of a cover-up, a deliberate erasure. They point to the way Russia expanded into Siberia, slowly consuming territories once marked as Tartarian, absorbing their names into its own. They suggest the rewriting of atlases was not innocent progress, but a calculated effort to bury a civilization whose existence threatened the official narrative of history. After all, maps are more than geography. They are instruments of memory and power. To redraw a boundary is to reshape reality, and there is more than ink on paper. Legends across Central Asia speak of a golden kingdom of towers and domes, humming with strange energy, swept away in cataclysm. Russian chronicles hint at rival dynasties long forgotten. Even Marco Polo, travelling through the region in the 13th century, described wealthy cities far beyond the frontiers of Europe, ruled by khans whose palaces gleamed with unimaginable splendour. Could these fragments be echoes of a Tartarian state whose traces were later scrubbed clean? Imagine standing in a library today, opening a dusty atlas from 1750. Your eyes drift across the page, following familiar names. Persia, India, Cathay, and then, in vast letters, Tartaria dominates the northern half of Asia. But when you reach for a modern schoolbook, that same land is parcelled into Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China, Tartaria gone as if it never was. Between those two pages yawns a silence. It is in that silence that conspiracy, myth, and possibility take root. The erasure of Tartaria raises the central theme of our journey: how civilizations can be not only destroyed, but forgotten by design. If Tartaria was indeed a lost civilization, more advanced, more harmonious, more dangerous to emerging powers, then its removal from maps may be the first step of a deliberate act of oblivion. To erase a name is to erase a people. To bury a history is to bury its warnings, its wonders, its legacy. But what if cartographers were not the only agents of this disappearance? What if nature itself conspired to hide Tartaria? As we turn to the next part, we leave the ink of maps and step into the earth itself, where cities seem to sink, where windows peer from beneath the ground, and where a mysterious flood of mud may have buried an empire alive. Imagine waking one morning to find your city half buried in earth. Yesterday, the streets were alive with shops and carriages, doorways and windows opening at ground level. Today, the same windows peer out from beneath the dirt, their arches suffocated, their doors leading only into walls of soil. A silence hangs in the air, broken only by the distant sound of shifting ground. This is the unsettling image at the heart of the mud flood hypothesis, a catastrophe of liquefied earth that may have entombed entire cities, not over centuries of decay, but suddenly within living memory. The signs are everywhere, if you know where to look. In Seattle, the famous underground reveals entire blocks of 19th century buildings preserved beneath the sidewalks. Tour guides point to ornate brick facades, whose first floors are now basements, their windows staring upward into the feet of passers-by. Official history explains it neatly. After the Great Fire of 1889, engineers raised the streets to improve drainage and combat flooding, leaving the old level sealed below. Yet even within this explanation, questions remain. Why were the buried structures so elaborately built if they were destined to vanish underground? Why does the temporary look more permanent than the new? Cross to Moscow, and you find churches whose lower arches are hidden below ground, their doors half buried. In St. Petersburg, windows appear at what should be basement level, yet display ornamentation that suggests they were once street-facing. In Paris, photographers capture row after row of windows, half buried beneath modern sidewalks, their symmetry and craftsmanship hinting at a deliberate design. Not the improvisation of cellars, but the sinking of once proud facades. And in Edinburgh, the South Bridge vaults sprawl beneath the city, sealed away for centuries, their stone chambers blackened by soot yet hauntingly intact, as though waiting to be rediscovered. Geologists propose rational explanations. Soil accumulates over centuries. Roads are raised for sanitation. Cities, they argue, are palimpsests, one layer built upon another. In Chicago, after the mid-19th century, engineers famously elevated entire blocks using thousands of jackscrews to install sewers beneath. In Paris, the rebuilding under Baron Haussmann raised street levels dramatically, yet the consistency of depth, often 10 to 20 feet of burial, appearing across continents within the same 18th and 19th century window, gnaws at the edges of credibility. How did so many cities worldwide undergo the same transformation at the same time? Proponents of the mud flood argue this was not incremental change, but a singular, devastating event. They imagine the earth itself turning to liquid, soil liquefaction, triggered by massive vibrations, perhaps from earthquakes, plasma discharges, or even advanced weaponry. When the ground transforms into slurry, entire buildings sink as though swallowed, and when the soil hardens again, it entombs them, preserving ornate doorways and windows in silence. The imagery is chilling. Picture a bustling street one evening, gas lamps glowing, carriages rattling. By dawn, the same street lies silent, its lower floors submerged in mud. Windows stare like blind eyes into packed earth, while rooftops poke out like survivors gasping for air. For those who lived through it, the world would have transformed overnight into a tomb. Some researchers point to written accounts. In 19th century Eastern Europe, newspapers describe sudden landslides of mud overwhelming homes. Folk tales from Russia tell of villages swallowed by the earth in a single night. In Central Asia, stories linger of temples buried so completely that only their domes remained visible above the soil. Could these be garbled memories of a worldwide event? In America, photographs from Salt Lake City and San Francisco show buildings where ground floor windows lie inexplicably below street level, their craftsmanship more ornate than the supposed pioneer builders could manage. In Europe, engravings reveal the same phenomenon. Windows at the wrong height, doors leading into nothing but dirt. These anomalies do not prove a mud flood, but they form a tapestry of questions. Skeptics counter with pragmatism. Cities evolve, disasters strike, and streets are razed. But the psychological unease remains. When you walk down a city block and see windows staring out from below the pavement, it feels less like urban planning and more like a crime scene, as though something was buried and someone wanted us not to notice. And here lies the most provocative suggestion, that the mud flood was not natural at all. Some propose it was engineered, a deliberate act to erase a civilization. Plasma storms from the sky, perhaps harnessed by hidden technologies, liquefied the earth. Or seismic resonances, triggered by devices we no longer understand, turned stone cities into buried relics. If Tartaria truly existed, if it wielded knowledge that threatened the rising powers of the industrial age, what better way to erase it than to bury it beneath our very feet? Imagine the shock of a labourer digging foundations for a modern building and uncovering a vaulted archway, perfectly intact, buried 20 feet down. Imagine the whispers when construction crews find elaborate masonry sealed away, as if time had stopped mid-century. These moments still occur. Photographs circulate of excavations revealing grand facades where no basement should be. The ground itself becomes a vault, hiding memories that official narratives cannot explain. The mud flood theory thrives in part because it feels like a metaphor made literal, history swallowed whole, buried under layers of soil and silence. Whether a natural cataclysm or a man-made event, its echoes remind us that civilizations do not simply vanish. They are entombed, they are hidden, and sometimes they wait to be rediscovered. And if the mud flood did occur, if entire cities were swallowed in a wave of liquefied earth, then what might still lie hidden beneath us? Vast chambers, streets preserved like time capsules, voices sealed behind stone. To answer that, we must descend further, not into theories, but into the very basements and tunnels of our cities, where the remnants of a buried world still linger. Step carefully down a narrow stairwell in Lower Manhattan. The roar of the city above fades until only the drip of water and the echo of your footsteps remain. Ahead, under dim bulbs strung across concrete, a brick arch curves overhead. An arch never meant to be seen by modern eyes. Its stones are too carefully cut, its symmetry too refined for a basement meant only to store crates. Here, beneath the avenues of New York, lies an architecture that feels borrowed from another time, a reminder that beneath our streets, whole worlds wait in silence. The New York subway system has revealed more than tracks and tunnels. Excavations in the early 20th century uncovered vaulted ceilings and arches buried far below the expected ground level. In some cases, stairways led nowhere, blocked by packed soil. Construction crews pressed for progress, simply built around these anomalies. Official explanations dismiss them as remnants of earlier construction phases or utility vaults. Yet the craftsmanship, ornate keystones, decorative lintels, suggests something grander. Were these basements or the first floors of a forgotten city buried alive? Chicago offers a similar mystery. After the Great Fire of 1871, engineers famously raised entire blocks using thousands of jackscrews, lifting buildings to install sewers beneath. Yet photographs taken during excavation reveal facades already sunken below street level, their windows half buried, their doors bricked shut. In some areas, workmen uncovered whole storefronts, intact yet sealed beneath new pavement. Were these merely the results of regrading, or evidence that Chicago was already half buried before the fire provided a convenient explanation? Travel to Edinburgh and you find the South Bridge vaults, a honeycomb of chambers sealed off for centuries beneath the city. When explorers pried open the arches in the 1980s, they found remnants of taverns, workshops, even family dwellings. Blackened hearths, discarded toys and pottery shards remained as if abandoned in haste. Why were entire communities bricked away, their lives sealed underground? Historians attribute it to dampness, crime, and disuse. Yet the sheer scale of the vaults, with their carefully engineered arches, hints at a different origin, perhaps part of a larger, earlier city swallowed and repurposed by later builders. Paris too keeps secrets underfoot. Beneath its boulevards stretch miles of catacombs and forgotten chambers. Some are lined with no modern streets, suggesting older foundations swallowed by centuries of rebuilding. In certain arrondissements, photographers capture rows of windows staring from below sidewalk level. Ornate, symmetrical, clearly designed to face the open air, not packed earth. To walk these streets is to feel that the city above is only a mask, layered atop something far older. And then there is Seattle. After the fire of 1889, city planners rebuilt atop the ruins, raising street levels by 20 feet. Today, visitors to the Seattle Underground stroll along sidewalks that once bustled at the surface. Ornate facades, cast-iron pillars, and arched windows remain preserved in the dim light as though frozen in another century. The official story tells of progress, a city raised against floods. But the preserved elegance of these basements raises suspicion. Why build so beautifully only to bury it? Across continents, the pattern repeats. Windows sunken below ground, arches bricked in, stairways leading into soil. Urban historians explain them as quirks of growth. Cities rise on their own rubble, streets elevated for sanitation. Yet the synchrony of depth, 10 to 20 feet, appearing in cities from Europe to America in the same centuries, feels less like coincidence and more like catastrophe. Imagine descending into one of these underground chambers by lantern light. Dust drifts through the air. The walls curve above you, echoing with the sound of your own breath. In the corner, an old window peers into packed soil, its iron grillwork rusted but intact. For a moment you feel as though you are trespassing in a world not meant for you, a world still waiting for its story to be told. Perhaps the basements are not basements at all. Perhaps they are the remains of ground floors, built for streets that no longer exist, buried suddenly and forgotten. If so, every step we take on the surface might carry us across rooftops of an older city, hidden in plain sight. And when you pass a row of windows sunk deep into the ground, do you see only clever engineering? Or do you feel the weight of something else? A silent testimony from a world we were never meant to remember. Where are you listening from tonight? And at what time? Share your thoughts. I'd love to see how far these buried echoes still travel. And if you find these mysteries intriguing, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey deeper into the shadows of forgotten history. Imagine walking into a grand old courthouse built in the 1800s. Its wooden doors tower 15 feet high. The staircase leading upward demands strides twice as long as yours. Inside, ceilings vanish into shadow, so far above they almost mock the idea of practicality. Why build on such a scale unless the intended inhabitants were larger than us? This is where the story of Tartaria intersects with one of humanity's oldest and most unsettling myths, the giants. Cultures across the world preserve tales of beings of extraordinary size. Greek titans, the Nephilim of the Bible, Norse Jötnar, red-haired giants in Native American lore. Could these myths echo a forgotten truth? That Tartaria was a civilization of giants, builders of the architecture that now feels oversized to our eyes? In the 19th century, American newspapers brimmed with sensational headlines. Miners in Ohio unearthing skeletons 8 feet tall, farmers in Wisconsin uncovering skulls with double rows of teeth, construction crews in Nevada finding entire caves filled with oversized bones. At the Lovelock Cave in Nevada, indigenous Paiute stories of cannibalistic red-haired giants suddenly aligned with reports of enormous skeletons unearthed during guano mining in the early 1900s. Though many of these remains disappeared into museum vaults or were dismissed as hoaxes, the sheer consistency of the reports is haunting. In the Ohio River Valley, mound builders left behind vast earthworks. Some accounts from the 1800s describe skeletons more than 7 feet long discovered inside the mounds, alongside copper tools too heavy for ordinary humans to wield comfortably. In Minnesota, a farmer's plough was said to have turned up bones so large they required a wagon for removal. In New York State, early settlers unearthed skulls large enough that they could place their heads within the jaws. Always the story repeats. Bones discovered, reported with excitement, then whisked away to vanish into obscurity. Siberia, once the heartland of Great Tartary, offers its own legends. Russian folklore speaks of the bogatirs, colossal warriors who roamed the steppes, shaping mountains with their hands and striding across rivers. Chronicles describe their strength in tones too matter-of-fact to be dismissed as pure invention. Could these tales preserve the memory of Tartarian inhabitants whose stature matched their architectural legacy? Even beyond Eurasia, myths converge. The Norse sagas tell of frost giants locked in eternal war with gods. Polynesian chants speak of long-limbed builders who raised stone platforms before the arrival of the islanders. In South America, Incan traditions describe Viracocha, a bearded giant god who walked the Andes and left behind megalithic works. The universality of the motif, the giant as builder, ruler, or adversary, suggests a shared human memory rather than coincidence. Skeptics argue the skeletons were misidentified animal bones, mastodon femurs mistaken for human remains, or that 19th century newspapers thrived on exaggeration. Indeed, some hoaxes were undeniable, staged to sell headlines. But the alignment of myths across disconnected cultures raises a deeper question. Why do so many peoples, separated by oceans and centuries, preserve stories of giants? Perhaps these are cultural memories of encounters with beings who truly once walked among us. The architecture itself seems to collaborate with the myth. Vaulted palaces in St. Petersburg, opera houses in San Francisco, and government halls in Washington, D.C., all echo with proportions that feel just slightly out of scale. Photographs from the 19th century sometimes show blurred figures, oddly tall, as though edited or erased to normalize the scene. Was Tartaria a civilization where giants lived alongside ordinary humans, or was it a world built entirely for them? Consider too the tools and armor preserved in museums. Oversized swords and suits of armor in Europe, sometimes standing more than 7 feet tall, are usually dismissed as ceremonial, yet their craftsmanship suggests practicality, as though they once fit warriors of extraordinary height. If these artifacts were ceremonial alone, why so many, scattered across different cultures? And why do their proportions fit so well with the skeletons reported in North America and Asia? If giants were real, their presence changes everything. A race with hands large enough to cradle boulders like pebbles would not need cranes to build cathedrals. Their voices, resonating deeper, might have tuned naturally with the frequencies of Tartarian sound technologies. Their sheer physicality could explain the star forts, the grand domes, the stairways that seem almost ceremonial in their vastness. But if these beings existed, where did they go? Were they destroyed in the mud flood? Were they hunted into extinction by smaller, more numerous humans? Or do traces of their bloodline linger in us, in fragments of DNA, in myths that refuse to die, in the architecture that still towers above us like a memory too large to erase? Imagine standing in front of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Its halls stretch so wide and ceilings so high that even crowds of people look diminished within them. For a moment, you wonder if these spaces were meant for us at all, or if we are simply trespassers in the ruins of beings who walked taller, built grander, and left behind whispers of their greatness. As we leave these shadows of giants behind, a new layer of mystery emerges. If Tartaria's people had extraordinary size, perhaps they also possessed extraordinary tools. Could the very stones of their buildings hide a secret technology, one not of brute force, but of sound itself? Imagine stepping into a vast cathedral just as the choir begins to sing. A single note rises and the air itself seems to tremble. The stone walls resonate, amplifying the sound until it is no longer just heard but felt, vibrating through your chest like a living presence. It is easy to believe the architecture was not only designed for worship, but for something far more mysterious, a hidden mastery of resonance. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, buildings attributed to the Tartarian style, domes, vaulted ceilings, star-shaped forts, exhibit acoustic properties that defy coincidence. In St. Petersburg's Kazan Cathedral, whispers travel across the nave with uncanny clarity. In Mexico's Metropolitan Cathedral, a voice at one end carries to the far side as though amplified by invisible hands. In Malta's underground hypogeum, Tones in the 110 Hz range cause bones to vibrate, inducing altered states of consciousness. Could Tartarian builders have inherited or rediscovered this ancient science of sound? Modern researchers call this field archaeoacoustics, the study of how ancient structures interact with sound. Tests at the hypogeum show that chanting within certain frequencies creates patterns of standing waves. Visitors often describe sensations of dizziness, visions, or trance-like calm. In Peru's Ollantaytambo, stones fit so tightly together that tapping them produces bell-like tones. In the temples of Angkor Wat, corridors create echoes that repeat like the ringing of gongs. Were these coincidences, or evidence of a universal technology woven into architecture itself? Theorists propose that Tartaria harnessed acoustic levitation, using sound to move and position massive stones. Today, scientists have demonstrated this principle on small scales. Droplets suspended in air by ultrasonic frequencies, grains of sand forming intricate geometric patterns when exposed to vibration, tiny beads hovering between speakers. If such effects can be achieved in laboratories now, what might have been possible for a civilization that built entire cities as resonant instruments? Consider the grand opera houses of Europe and America, many of them emerging in the 19th century, with designs eerily aligned to Tartarian proportions. Their domes and chambers resonate in ways that amplify not just music, but intent. Some researchers believe these halls functioned as resonance chambers, places where frequencies could be harnessed to energize, to heal, or even to manipulate matter. The phenomenon of cymatics, sand or water forming geometric shapes under vibration, offers a tantalizing clue. Perhaps Tartarians tuned their architecture to generate such patterns of energy across their empire. Legends hint at this possibility. Russian folklore tells of crystal palaces whose walls sang with healing tones. In Siberian shamanic traditions, there are stories of mountains that hummed when approached with chants. Even in medieval European chronicles, rumours circulate of bells that could shatter glass or induce visions, artifacts said to come from lands to the east. Skeptics counter that acoustics are simply the byproduct of large stone spaces. A dome echoes because of its shape. A cathedral carries sound because of its size. Yet the argument falters when confronted with the precision of the alignments. Why do so many Tartarian-style buildings share proportions linked to harmonic ratios? Why are frequencies like 110 Hz or 432 Hz, tones associated with calming or altered states, so often embedded in their design? Chance seems less likely than intention. Imagine a world where cities themselves were symphonies, streets laid out not for convenience but for resonance, domes tuned like instruments, plazas designed to amplify collective chants. In such a society, the line between science, spirituality, and technology would blur. Energy could flow not through wires but through sound. Illness could be treated not with medicine but with vibration. In that light, Tartaria becomes not a lost empire but a lost harmony, a civilization that built not against nature but with it. Even hints of this survive today. In Washington's Capitol Rotunda, a whisper at one end of the gallery can be heard at the opposite wall. In St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the whispering gallery produces the same uncanny effect. Visitors describe the sensation not merely as sound, but as presence, as though the walls themselves participate in the conversation. Could these buildings be modern descendants, faint echoes of a deeper tradition? If Tartaria mastered resonance, its erasure becomes even more suspicious. For what greater threat to emerging industrial powers than a civilization whose energy could not be commodified, whose buildings themselves generated power? Imagine the oil barons, the coal magnates, the inventors of engines, all confronted by a society that needed none of them, that drew power from the very air. Perhaps that is why so much Tartarian architecture was buried, destroyed, or repurposed. The silence of the present may not be the absence of resonance, but its suppression. Walk through a cathedral at dusk, when the last note of the organ fades, and the silence itself feels heavy, almost charged. It is as if the frequency has been switched off, leaving only memory behind. and yet fragments endure. A single hum in the hypogem, a bell tone in a Russian palace, the uncanny clarity of a whisper in a star fort. They remind us that sound is more than entertainment. It is power, one that shapes stone, mind, and memory alike. If Tartaria once tuned the world itself to its frequency, then the skies above may hold the next clue. For what if the same energies that lifted voices in stone halls also lifted vessels into the air? Vast airships that glided without engines, powered by the resonance of the very ether? Now lift your eyes from the buried streets and vaulted halls. Imagine the sky itself filled with colossal vessels, their silvered hulls gliding silently above rooftops. No roar of engines, no trail of smoke, only a soft hum, as though the air itself carried them. These are the visions that haunt the lore of Tartaria. Vast airships, not crude balloons, but vessels that seem to defy gravity, bridging continents in ways our textbooks claim impossible for the 19th century. Old photographs sometimes reveal them, grainy silhouettes hovering above city skylines, too immense, too stable, to be dismissed as fragile hot air contraptions. In one image from California, a cigar-shaped craft floats above telephone poles. In another from Germany, a vessel hangs in the sky with a presence that feels more like a ship at sea than an experimental balloon. Skeptics call these photographic anomalies or hoaxes. Yet when viewed together, they suggest a pattern, a memory of skies once busier than we are told. Patents of the late 1800s only deepen the intrigue. Engineers like Charles Delshow filled notebooks with fantastical airship designs, some powered not by gas, but by secret aeros, or coils drawing unseen energy from the air. Nikola Tesla envisioned flying machines that could draw wireless power directly from the ionosphere, needing no fuel at all. Was Tesla dreaming alone, or was he echoing the last whispers of Tartarian knowledge, technologies suppressed before they could take root? Consider the infrastructure hinted at in historical sketches. Mooring masts atop skyscrapers in New York, designs that seem out of proportion for mere balloons. Why would architects build docking points on towers unless airships were expected to use them? And not just experimental craft, but vessels capable of carrying passengers, cargo, and perhaps entire communities through the air. Descriptions of these craft often include not only silence but illumination. Glowing lights, radiant halos, even a faint hum felt more than heard. Could they have been powered by resonance technologies akin to those embedded in Tartarian cathedrals and forts? If crystal arrays or geometric structures could focus atmospheric electricity, perhaps they fed these ships, allowing them to float effortlessly across continents. The Tunguska explosion of 1908 adds another layer of suspicion. Officially, it was a meteor exploding in the atmosphere, flattening forests across Siberia. Yet no impact crater was ever found. Witnesses described a glowing object streaking across the sky, silent until the blast. Some theorists propose it was not a meteor at all, but the catastrophic failure of a Tartarian energy device, or even an airship its power source destabilized. How curious that Tunguska struck in the very heart of former Tartarian lands. Legends around the world echo with hints of skyborne craft. Chinese chronicles tell of palaces that drifted among the clouds. Hindu texts describe vimanas, flying chariots powered by sound and light. In medieval Europe, tales of airships appear in chronicles, sometimes dismissed as angelic visions. Could Tartaria have been the inheritor of this lineage, the last to field fleets of vessels that navigated the ether as naturally as ships sail seas? Skeptics argue airships did exist. Hydrogen-filled zeppelins, prone to fire, fragile in storms. They point to disasters like the Hindenburg in 1937 as proof of their limits. But what if those tragedies were not accidents of technology, but staged endings, spectacles designed to discredit an older knowledge? A fleet of silent, fuel-free ships would have threatened the new empires of oil and coal. Better perhaps to bury the possibility than to allow it to take root. Imagine standing in a city square in 1890. Overhead, a vast vessel drifts, casting its shadow across the cobblestones. Children point skyward, merchants pause mid-sail, and for a moment the crowd is united in awe. Then decades later, the same square bustles with cars and wires, and no one remembers the ship that once hovered above. The silence of the sky becomes its own form of erasure. If Tartaria's skies were once alive with airships, then its empire was not limited by distance. It could connect Siberia to Europe, Asia to the Americas, in ways that confound our linear histories. And if those ships drew their power from star forts, domes, and crystalline grids, then the very Earth was their launch pad and the sky their highway. Today, fragments of this vision linger. Enthusiasts pore over faded patents, blurry photographs, and accounts of mysterious craft seen in the 19th century. Some even argue that modern UFO sightings are not alien at all, but remnants, or descendants, of Tartarian airships, their designs rediscovered in secret projects, their power systems still too dangerous or liberating to be released to the public. Whether real or imagined, the image endures. A silent fleet gliding across the horizon, powered not by smoke and fire, but by resonance and light. And as we turn from the sky back to the Earth, we find the same geometry repeating below. Star-shaped bastions scattered across continents, dismissed as forts of war, but perhaps serving as nodes of energy in a forgotten grid. Stand atop the walls of Fort Bourtange in the Netherlands. From above, the structure unfurls like a vast snowflake, bastions radiating outward in perfect geometry, every angle deliberate, every proportion echoing hidden mathematics. Mainstream historians tell us such forts were designed in the Renaissance to deflect cannon fire. But when you compare them to others, Fort Monroe in Virginia, Palma Nova in Italy, mysterious star-shaped earthworks in India and Africa, a deeper pattern emerges. These are not isolated defences. They are a global design language, repeating across continents as though scripted by a single hand. The star fort phenomenon stretches far beyond Europe. In India, the ruins of Vijayanagara and coastal forts like Bakal display polygonal, radiating bastions that mirror European designs yet predate colonial influence. In Japan, the fortress of Goryo-Kaku radiates in a five-pointed star, astonishingly similar to Italian models. Across Africa, remnants of earthworks in Benin and Angola show bastions carved in similar forms. How could cultures separated by oceans converge on the same design with such precision? Was it diffusion through trade and empire, or inheritance from a deeper source, perhaps Tartaria's lost blueprint? The scale alone stirs wonder. Many star forts span kilometres, with walls so vast they create their own landscapes. Their moats form not just barriers, but reflective surfaces, turning each fort into a mandala of water and stone. Some align to cardinal directions with near-perfect accuracy. Others echo astronomical cycles, their bastions pointing towards solstice sunrises or lunar extremes. In Palma Nova, the star city of Italy, the nine-pointed design radiates from a central plaza, as though intended not only for defence but for cosmology. A terrestrial mandala binding heaven and earth. Mainstream accounts insist the geometry is practical. The star shape maximised defensive firepower, ensuring no wall was left vulnerable. But this logic falters when confronted with scale and placement. Why construct such elaborate shapes in remote regions unlikely to see siege? Why repeat the design even when terrain rendered the geometry impractical? And why do so many forts echo sacred geometry, the golden ratio, Pythagorean triangles, harmonic proportions, more at home in temples than battlefields? Theorists propose that star forts were more than military structures. They were energy nodes, vast resonators designed to focus and distribute the Earth's natural currents. The star shape, with its projecting bastions, may have amplified or channeled electromagnetic flows. Water-filled moats could have conducted energy, while the symmetry of stone walls created resonance chambers. In this view, the forts were not defences against cannonballs, but instruments in a planetary grid, powering Tartarian airships, illuminating cities, or harmonizing entire regions. Accounts of unusual phenomena lend weight to the theory. At Fort Monroe in Virginia, visitors with electromagnetic detectors report unexplained surges during solar storms, as if the fort still responds to cosmic activity. In Belgium, near Fort Eben Emael, locals have spoken of strange humming sounds during lightning strikes. At Palmanova, residents describe odd clarity of voice when speaking in the central plaza, as though the entire city amplifies sound. Could these be remnants of technologies we no longer understand? Consider the symbolism encoded in their shapes. The star is one of humanity's oldest sacred icons, appearing in Sumerian tablets, Celtic carvings, and Islamic mosaics. The pentagram, hexagram, and nine-pointed star each carry mathematical and mystical associations. To embed such symbols in fortresses suggests a dual purpose: outwardly military, inwardly spiritual or energetic. Perhaps the forts were camouflage, ancient power stations disguised as bastions in an age that had forgotten their original function. Skeptics counter that geometry alone proves nothing. Engineers copy effective designs, and the star fort was simply the best solution against cannon fire. They point to the writings of Renaissance engineers like Vauban, who perfected the form for France. Yet this explanation leaves unanswered why similar designs appear globally, even where European influence was minimal. It also ignores the consistent use of sacred ratios, far beyond what pure utility would demand. Imagine flying above Europe in the 1600s. Below, star forts dot the land, glowing in symmetry, their moats shimmering in moonlight. From the air, they would form constellations of stone, each connected like points in a larger pattern. If Tartaria truly commanded fleets of airships, perhaps these forts were not meant to repel armies from below, but to guide vessels from above. Navigation beacons, energy hubs, or even landing grids disguised as military architecture. And there is the curious fact of abandonment. Many star forts were decommissioned quickly, left to crumble even before they saw battle. Others were filled in, dismantled, or converted into parks. Why invest enormous resources in construction only to discard them within decades? Was it because their real function, energetic, not military, was no longer understood? Or because new rulers wished to bury evidence of their true purpose? Even in ruin, they retain a haunting presence. Walk the grass-grown bastions of Fort Bourtange at dawn, and the air feels unnaturally still, as though the geometry itself holds the landscape in balance. Stand in Palmanova's central plaza, and the radiating streets seem to draw you outward toward infinity. These are not simply walls of war, they are maps in stone, guiding us toward a forgotten harmony between earth, sky, and structure. If Tartaria left its fingerprints anywhere, it may be here, in the global constellation of star forts. Military historians may insist they were pragmatic defences, but their geometry whispers otherwise. They hum with the suggestion of something greater, an architecture that resonated with the earth itself. And if the ground once glowed with these designs, what of the spectacles above it? For there were times when whole cities appeared, shining with domes and palaces, only to vanish as quickly as they came. To uncover that story, we must step into the dazzling but unsettling world of the world's fairs, where the white cities rose in impossible splendour, then disappeared as if they had never existed. Imagine arriving in Chicago in the summer of 1893. Rising from the swamps of Jackson Park is a glittering metropolis, domes, colonnades, arches and towers gleaming white beneath electric light. It is called the World's Columbian Exposition, but visitors simply call it the White City. Over 200 grand buildings stretch across 600 acres, their facades rivaling Rome and St. Petersburg, their boulevards alive with gondolas, fountains, and orchestras. And then, within a year, it is gone, demolished, burned, erased, as if the city itself had been a mirage. The official story insists the White City was temporary. Its palaces and halls, constructed of plaster and fibre over wooden frames, were built to dazzle, not to last. Yet photographs tell another tale. Look closely, and you see intricate stonework, soaring domes with steel skeletons, and detailing far too ornate to be dismissed as mere staff material. How could such vast structures be built in just 2 years, in a city still reeling from the Great Fire of 1871? Even more puzzling, Why invest so much in magnificence if it was destined for destruction? This puzzle repeats across the globe. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair sprawled over 1,200 acres, boasting palaces, lagoons, and monumental arches. In San Francisco, the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition raised entire boulevards of marble-white grandeur crowned by the Palace of Fine Arts. In Paris, Brussels, and even smaller cities, expositions appeared with impossible speed, dazzling visitors, then were dismantled, leaving behind only fragments. If these were truly temporary, why did so many look built for centuries? Some researchers argue that these fairs were not feats of quick construction, but resurrections of older architecture, perhaps Tartarian remnants unearthed and displayed for a brief moment before being erased again. Imagine grand halls and palaces long buried by mud or fire, suddenly revealed by excavation, then paraded as marvels of modern engineering. Hagst. By branding them temporary, the organisers could demolish them without suspicion, ensuring the public never asked who really built these. Consider the psychological effect. Millions of visitors poured into these expositions. For many, it was their first encounter with electricity, elevators, and vast domes glowing in the night. The fairs presented a vision of the future, yet what if that future was really the past? An echo of Tartaria's forgotten brilliance. To walk those streets was to stroll through a phantom empire, told it was new, only to watch it vanish into smoke and rubble. The strange emptiness of photographs fuels suspicion. Despite reports of massive crowds, many images of the fairs show wide boulevards with only a handful of people. Long exposure times are the explanation, moving figures blurred into invisibility. Yet the eeriness remains, entire cities gleaming and deserted, like stage sets awaiting an audience that never comes. The ritual of destruction is equally haunting. Fires frequently consumed exposition sites within years, reducing whole complexes to ash. The White City burned in 1894. The St. Louis palaces dismantled. San Francisco's temporary marble dissolved into dust. Only fragments, like the Palace of Fine Arts or the Paris Grand Palais, remain as stubborn witnesses, reminders of an era that should not have been possible. Hidden symbolism laces the fairs as well. Ceremonies were steeped in Masonic imagery, cornerstones laid with ritual, domes echoing ancient cosmology, statuary recalling gods and giants. In Chicago, the Court of Honor's layout mirrored sacred geometry, resembling mandalas or star-fort patterns when viewed from above. Was this spectacle merely aesthetic, or a coded acknowledgement that these were sites of power once belonging to another age? The White City also marked the public debut of Nikola Tesla's alternating current, illuminating entire boulevards in a glow that seemed otherworldly. To the public, this was progress. Yet for Tartarian theorists, the sudden presence of vast electrified architecture suggests something else, that the structures themselves were designed long before, their geometry resonating with energy, awaiting rediscovery. The fair may have been less about invention than about testing, studying, and then erasing technologies incompatible with the industrial order that was about to dominate the 20th century. Skeptics point out that fairs were global spectacles of national pride designed to showcase industry and artistry. Temporary plaster over wooden frames explained the speed, the grandeur, and the rapid demolition. They argue there is no mystery, just pragmatism. And yet the pattern cannot be ignored. Colossal cities conjured overnight, then obliterated over and over again. If the purpose was purely practical, why repeat such extravagance on such an unsustainable scale? Imagine standing in Jackson Park as night falls in 1893. Electric lamps sparkle on the lagoon, reflecting columns and domes glowing like alabaster under moonlight. Music drifts from a distant bandstand. For a moment it feels eternal, a glimpse of utopia. Then months later it is rubble, smoke, and silence, as though it never existed. The visitor is left haunted, uncertain if they witnessed reality or dream. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the White City was not meant to endure, but to remind, briefly, of what had been lost. A memory conjured, then extinguished, keeping Tartaria's echo alive yet hidden, and when the fairs vanished, so too did their architecture, their energy, their illusions. All that remained were ashes, photographs, and whispers that something grand had been shown, then stolen away again. But not all erasures come cloaked in spectacle. Some arrive as catastrophe. Flames, earthquakes, and blasts so immense they reset entire cities. To understand how Tartaria's remnants may have been systematically destroyed, we must turn next to those sudden devastations, the great fires, the quakes, and the mysterious explosions that swept away the traces of a forgotten empire. Picture Chicago in 1871. Flames leap from roof to roof, consuming 3 square miles of the city in less than 2 days. The official story blames a cow kicking over a lantern in a barn. Yet when the smoke cleared, eyewitnesses reported something stranger. Stone buildings fused as if by glass-making heat, iron warped like clay, bricks reduced to ash. Entire districts of ornate architecture, reminiscent of European grandeur, were gone. Curiously, many wooden shacks at the edges of the fire survived, while massive stone structures in the city centre crumbled into rubble. Could the Great Chicago Fire have been more than an accident? Photographs taken after the fire reveal empty streets lined with ruins. Arches and facades rise like skeletons, blackened yet eerily symmetrical. Some survivors described fireballs falling from the sky, sparks that seemed to leap unnaturally, even explosions that came from below ground. If these reports hold any truth, then the cow and lantern story was less history than cover tale, a convenient way to explain a catastrophe that may have been engineered. San Francisco in 1906 offers another unsettling parallel. A magnitude 7.9 earthquake struck at dawn, toppling buildings and igniting fires that raged for days. More than 80% of the city was destroyed. But in the rubble, stories emerged. Workers claimed to find entire sections of masonry buried beneath layers of soil, as if older architecture had been entombed before the quake. Witnesses described flashes of light in the sky before the tremors, strange electrical phenomena that linger in folklore. The disaster not only leveled the city, but also cleared ground for a new San Francisco, its pre-quake Tartarian-style structures largely erased. And then comes Siberia, 1908, the Tunguska event. An explosion flattened 800 square miles of forest, trees scorched and snapped like matchsticks. No impact crater was ever found. Officially, it was a meteor or comet exploding in the atmosphere. Yet witnesses spoke of a glowing object moving silently across the sky, followed by blinding flashes and thunderous shockwaves. Some said the night skies glowed for weeks afterward, bright enough to read newspapers in London. Was this really a space rock, or the catastrophic failure of Tartarian technology? Theorists whisper of a massive energy device or even an airship igniting in the sky, its fall marking the last gasp of a forgotten civilization. Evidence of other mysterious devastations can be found worldwide. In Scotland, vitrified forts, stone walls melted as though by intense fire, dot the landscape. Archaeologists struggle to explain them. No wood fire, no ancient torch could reach the temperatures needed to fuse stone. In India, near Jodhpur, legends speak of an ancient city destroyed by a flash of light that left buildings crumbling and people with burns described in eerily modern terms. Some researchers speculate about forgotten weapons, harnessing plasma or energy beyond our present grasp. Patterns emerge. Fires in Boston, Toronto, and Baltimore during the late 19th century shared strange characteristics. Winds that shifted unpredictably, blazes that leapt across fire breaks, masonry collapsing in ways ordinary heat should not allow. Earthquakes in Lisbon and Messina produced not only tremors, but inexplicable floods of mud, burying sections of cities in minutes. Each time, ornate architecture was lost, replaced with modern grids. The destruction was followed swiftly by reconstruction, as though catastrophe served as a reset button. Skeptics attribute all of this to chance and misfortune. Wooden cities burned easily, earthquakes are common on fault lines, and Tunguska was a natural space event. To them, the repetition of disaster is the repetition of probability. Yet the timing unsettles. The very decades when Tartaria disappears from maps are the decades when flames, quakes, and explosions consume its supposed cities. Coincidence or conspiracy? Imagine the experience of a survivor. You wake to thunder, the ground shaking beneath your feet. The streets outside are filled with smoke and fire. Walls collapse, sparks rain down. In hours, your city is gone, replaced with rubble. Within weeks, surveyors arrive, plans are drawn, and a new city begins to rise. Yet it is not the same city. Its old identity is buried with the rubble, its grand facades replaced by the architecture of a new age. The memory of what was lost fades in a single generation. What if disaster itself was the weapon? Firestorms that burn hotter than nature allows, quakes amplified by hidden technologies, explosions that flatten forests without craters. Each erasure leaves a clean slate, ready for rebuilding in the image of the victors. Each silence swallows not only buildings but histories, leaving us to wonder what was really destroyed. When cities are erased, memories often linger in myth, and myths in turn point backward, to stories of even greater cataclysms that swallowed entire continents. If Tartaria was reset by fire and quake, perhaps it was only the latest echo in a cycle. For before Tartaria, other motherlands were said to have fallen, drowned beneath the seas. Mu, Lemuria, Atlantis. To follow Tartaria's trail, we must now descend into the depths of legend, where continents themselves rise and vanish like breath upon the water. Close your eyes and sink beneath the waves. Imagine colossal towers rising from the seafloor, their crystalline spires glowing faintly in the dark. Statues half buried in coral gaze upward as if waiting for rescue. This is the dream of Mu, Lemuria, and Atlantis, the so-called motherlands of humanity, civilizations said to have thrived before being swallowed by ocean and fire. What if Tartaria was not an isolated mystery, but the heir to these drowned empires? In the early 20th century, British Colonel James Churchward claimed to have deciphered ancient tablets in India describing Mu, a vast Pacific continent. He painted a vision of a civilization 50,000 years old, stretching from Easter Island to the Marianas. Its people, he wrote, mastered crystal technology, drew on cosmic forces, and seeded cultures across the globe. When Mu sank in cataclysm, survivors fled, some to South America, others to Egypt, and still others across Central Asia. Could Tartaria have been one of those colonies, an echo of Mu's brilliance carried into the future? Legends from Polynesia and Micronesia echo this memory. Islanders sing of sunken lands beneath the waves, of ancestors who arrived in canoes guided by stars after their homeland vanished in fire and flood. Easter Island's statues, with their massive forms and enigmatic gazes, are said to watch over a drowned continent just beyond the horizon. Plato's tale of Atlantis is more familiar. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he described a naval power beyond the Pillars of Hercules, with concentric rings of land and water, advanced metallurgy, and a hubris that brought divine retribution. In a single day and night, earthquakes and floods destroyed it, leaving only memory. For centuries, the story has been treated as allegory, yet tantalizing hints keep surfacing. The ruins off Yonaguni in Japan, terraces that look carved by hands, the Bimini Road in the Bahamas, a line of stones suggestive of an ancient harbour, the submerged city of Heraklion near Egypt, rediscovered beneath the Mediterranean sands. Theosophists added another lost motherland, Lemuria, a hypothesized landmass in the Indian Ocean. Though originally suggested to explain the distribution of lemurs and flora, it was quickly absorbed into esoteric lore. Madame Blavatsky and her followers described Lemuria as a land of tall, spiritually attuned beings, masters of telepathy and energy. When volcanic fire and rising seas destroyed it, they too scattered, leaving fragments of knowledge behind. Could Tartaria have been one of those fragments, a later inheritor of their wisdom? The star forts of Eurasia recall the mandalas of Mu. The domes of St. Petersburg echo Atlantis' celestial orbs. The legends of giants in Siberia and the Americas might be faded memories of Lemurian root races, once vast in stature before dwindling. Consider the timing. Geological studies confirm that sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, drowning land bridges and coastal settlements. Doggerland, once a fertile plain linking Britain to Europe, now lies beneath the North Sea. Sunda, the ancient landmass of Southeast Asia, was submerged as seas rose, scattering its people to islands. If entire regions of human habitation were erased within centuries, is it truly so impossible that larger civilizations, like Mu or Atlantis, could have met the same fate? Skeptics remind us that Churchward's tablets were never produced, that Plato's tale is framed as philosophy, and that Lemuria began as a scientific mistake. But myth is often the shadow of truth. Flood stories appear in over 200 cultures worldwide, from the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, to the Hopi's tale of a deluge, to the Maori stories of lands swallowed by waves. Myths may not preserve dates, but they preserve trauma. When the sea rises to take your world, memory lingers in story long after evidence lies buried. Imagine Tartaria as the last link in this chain. Survivors of older motherlands carried fragments of geometry, resonance and energy, building anew on the Eurasian steppes. For centuries they thrived, their domes glowing, their airships rising, until a new cataclysm, mud floods, fires, quakes, swept them away as surely as the ocean swallowed their forerunners. In this view, history is not linear but cyclical, civilizations blooming like flowers before being cut down, leaving seeds that sprout again in unexpected places. Picture the seafloor near Yonaguni, steps and terraces covered in coral, as though an amphitheatre lies waiting in silence. Picture divers swimming along the Bimini Road, running their hands across smooth-cut blocks that seem too precise for chance. Picture the Siberian plains, once the heart of Tartaria, where travellers still find megaliths aligned with the stars. These scattered pieces might all be echoes of the same story. Motherlands lost, daughters rising, each in turn destroyed and forgotten. If Tartaria was indeed the heir of Mu, Lemuria, or Atlantis, then its erasure becomes part of a larger pattern. The cycle of civilization is one of rise and obliteration, remembrance and forgetting. Each time, the survivors scatter like seeds on the wind, carrying fragments of knowledge, leaving behind whispers in myth and ruins in stone. And if prophecy preserves the memory of these collapses, perhaps it also names their destroyers. For in the texts of Ezekiel, in the Quran, and in medieval maps, the lands of Tartaria are shadowed by two ominous names, Gog and Magog, forces of invasion, chaos and apocalypse. Were they enemies from without, or the very powers that ensured Tartaria's silence? In the hushed chambers of ancient prophecy, two names echo again and again, Gog and Magog. To some they are nations, to others monstrous tribes, and to still others symbols of chaos itself. In the book of Ezekiel, Gog and Magog rise from the remote north, gathering countless hosts to march against the people of the world in a final war. In the Quran, they appear as Yajuj and Majuj, destructive hordes sealed behind a wall of iron and copper by Dhul Qarnayn, often identified with Alexander the Great. In medieval Europe, mapmakers placed them beyond the known world, penned into the wilderness of Asia. And in those very regions, from Siberia to Central Asia, maps centuries later would inscribe a vast dominion, Tartaria. What if prophecy, myth, and geography were not separate threads, but overlapping views of the same reality? Could the tales of Gog and Magog be distorted memories of Tartarian peoples, or the narrative imposed by those who erased them? The Catalan Atlas of 1375 depicts Gog and Magog enclosed by mountains near the Caspian Sea. In some versions they are linked to the Scythians or the Mongols, portrayed as ferocious invaders. Medieval chronicles often describe them as cannibals or giants, their numbers so vast that they could drink rivers dry. European monks, fearful of Mongol invasions, identified Genghis Khan's armies with these biblical enemies. By association, the lands east of Europe became marked as the dwelling place of apocalyptic forces. Could this demonization have laid the groundwork for erasing an empire later remembered as Tartaria? Legends of the Caucasus Mountains reinforce this impression. Travellers spoke of colossal gates of iron built by Alexander, still standing between ridges, meant to imprison the wild tribes of the north. In Derbent, on the Caspian shore, walls and gates stretch between mountain and sea, a structure so immense that it has been called the Caspian Gates. Were these simply fortifications, or the remnants of something older, interpreted by later cultures as barriers against the apocalyptic hordes? The symbolism endured into the modern age. During the Crusades, tales spread of a Christian king, Prester John, locked in combat with Gog and Magog in the distant east. Marco Polo spoke of tribes beyond Cathay, barbarous and strange, who might one day flood into the west. Each account blurred fact and myth, turning real peoples into the embodiment of fear. By the time Tartaria appeared on European maps, the land was already steeped in an aura of menace, its peoples imagined as monstrous, its territory shadowed by prophecy. And yet, in some interpretations, Gog and Magog are not enemies of Tartaria, but Tartaria itself. To biblical scribes, any immense power beyond the frontier could be cast as apocalyptic threat. To later chroniclers, the sheer vastness of Tartaria, with its strange architecture and unfamiliar peoples, may have seemed alien enough to embody the role of chaos. By framing the empire as Gog and Magog, victors could justify its obliteration. Erasure becomes salvation. Conquest becomes prophecy fulfilled. This duality continues in esoteric readings. Some theorists suggest that Gog and Magog were not tribes of flesh, but forces from another dimension, entities breaching the gates of time. In this view, the Great Walls of the Caucasus, or Central Asia, were more than fortresses. They were seals, built to hold back interdimensional intruders. When the gates failed, Tartaria fell, its destruction retold as apocalypse in religious texts. The resonance of these names persists. In 2014, during the opening ceremony of the Sochi Winter Olympics, held in a region once within Tartaria's borders, a strange sequence played out. A harmonious city was shown, threatened by shadows and flames, until a great sun rose overhead to banish the darkness. To many it was simple pageantry, but others saw it as a ritual retelling of an ancient war, Tartaria, and its fall to the forces of Gog and Magog. Symbols of prophecy enacted in modern spectacle, reminding us that myths never fully die. Skeptics argue that Gog and Magog are nothing more than metaphors. In Ezekiel, they symbolize the ultimate adversary of God's people, not real nations. In the Quran, they serve as a warning of unchecked chaos. Medieval cartographers, filling in blanks on their charts, merely placed them in the unknown east. To project Tartaria onto this canvas, they say, is to confuse allegory with archaeology. And yet, the geographical overlap is difficult to ignore. Again and again, maps, texts, and prophecies place Gog and Magog in the very regions later labelled Tartaria. The association may not prove identity, but it suggests a continuity of perception. The lands of the far north and east have long been cast as other, as both powerful and dangerous, as both real and mythic. Imagine standing at the Caspian Gates at twilight. The stones glow faintly in the fading sun, stretching from mountain to sea. Beyond lies a vast steppe, empty now, but once the heart of Tartaria. Do the gates still hold back enemies long vanished, or do they stand as monuments to a story rewritten, a reminder of how easily an empire can be transformed into a prophecy of doom? If Tartaria's memory was entombed in myth, then the next chapter of its erasure may have been more material, not only prophecy and demonization, but the literal removal of its people. For as cities lay emptied, trains began to carry thousands of children into new lands. Were these orphans truly abandoned? Or were they the last survivors of a civilization whose bloodlines had to be scattered to complete the erasure? Picture a train whistle echoing across the American plains in the late 1800s. Car after car, filled not with coal or cattle, but with children, thousands of them, shipped from the crowded streets of New York and Boston to distant farmsteads in the Midwest. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 young people were relocated this way, in what history remembers as the orphan train movement. On the surface, it was a humanitarian effort. Reformers like Charles Loring Brace sought to rescue abandoned children from urban poverty and crime. Orphanages overflowed. Workhouses stank of disease. Newspapers lamented the plight of the street urchin. The trains, according to official accounts, gave these children a chance at new lives with farm families in America's heartland. Yet beneath the surface, the sheer scale unsettles the mind. 250,000 children uprooted, so many that records blurred, identities vanished, and origins became unknowable. Conspiracy researchers see in this mass relocation something darker, a systematic repopulation. They argue that these children were not all orphans in the ordinary sense. Some may have been seized from impoverished or immigrant families. Others perhaps were survivors of cataclysms, the mud floods, fires, or resets that erased Tartarian cities. To erase a civilization is not only to bury its buildings, but to scatter its people. Children, stripped of lineage and history, could be absorbed into the new order without question. Photographs from the era intensify the unease. Rows of solemn children stand in front of clapboard depots, tags tied to their coats like parcels. In some towns, orphan auctions were held, where farmers inspected children before choosing whom to adopt. Officially, families offered homes. Unofficially, some children became labourers. Many never learned their real surnames, their lineages severed forever. To Tartarian theorists, this was not accident but design, a way to dissolve surviving bloodlines into anonymity. The Oddfellows, a fraternal order that expanded rapidly in the 19th century, play a curious role in this story. Their lodges often included orphanages and schools. Their rituals centered on caring for widows and orphans, but also carried symbolism of secrecy and rebirth. Conspiracy researchers suggest they may have been custodians of this repopulation project, sheltering displaced children while ensuring they grew without memory of their origins. In this reading, fraternal orders served as both guardians and gatekeepers, absorbing fragments of a lost people into the fabric of a new society. The World's Fairs intersect strangely with this narrative. At the 1904 St. Louis Exposition, one of the most visited exhibits displayed premature infants in glass incubators. Nurses tended rows of babies while the public peered in awe. Promoted as scientific marvels, these infant incubator shows were repeated at other fairs. To modernize, they look like the dawn of neonatal medicine. Yet to those suspicious of resets, the symbolism is chilling. Babies displayed as if manufactured, a spectacle of new life, rising just as old architecture and populations were erased. Folklore mirrors these themes. In the late 19th century, stories spread of cabbage patch babies found in gardens, a myth that inspired a popular children's toy a century later. Harmless in appearance, but perhaps echoing a cultural memory of children who seem to appear from nowhere, orphans without pasts, arrivals without ancestry. Official history provides its own defense. The orphan trains, historians insist, were responses to urban crises, not conspiracies. Poverty, immigration, and disease left thousands of children abandoned. Brace and others, motivated by religious zeal, sought to place them in healthier environments. Records of mistreatment exist, but so too do accounts of children who found loving families. From this view, the orphan trains were imperfect charity, not deliberate erasure. And yet, questions linger. Why were records so often lost or destroyed? Why did so many children travel in silence, their stories forgotten? And why did this massive redistribution of human life coincide with the very decades when Tartaria supposedly disappeared from maps, when cities were buried or burned, when World's Fairs rose and vanished? Imagine walking through a small Midwestern town in 1890. The streets are lined with stately brick buildings, banks with columns, courthouses with domes, theatres with ornate arches. Photographs from the period show these grand facades standing silent, streets almost empty of people. A few decades later, orphan trains roll into the station, and suddenly the emptiness is filled. Children spill onto the streets, claimed by families, absorbed into the new community. Who built those buildings before? Where were the original inhabitants? If Tartaria truly existed, perhaps these children were its last remnants, seedlings transplanted into new soil. By raising them without memory, the cycle of amnesia was complete. A civilization could be erased not only in stone and ink, but in blood. Skeptics shake their heads. To them, the orphan trains are tragic but explainable. Yet to those who sense deeper currents, the train's whistles still echo like dirges for a forgotten empire. Each child stepping off those cars may have been a page torn from a book we are no longer allowed to read. And so, the question remains: were the orphan trains acts of compassion, or were they the final stage of a reset, the human face of Tartaria's erasure? Beneath the surface of our skin lies the oldest archive of all, the double helix, carrying memories written not in ink or stone, but in code. Each twist of DNA is like a scroll of history, recording unions, migrations, and encounters stretching back tens of thousands of years. In recent decades, geneticists sequencing the human genome have uncovered traces of ghost populations, ancient groups that interbred with our ancestors, leaving fragments of DNA that persist even today. Among them are the Neanderthals and the mysterious Denisovans, identified through a finger bone and a few teeth in a Siberian cave. Their fragments ripple through millions alive today. Could Tartaria's legacy also be hidden here, entwined in our chromosomes? Theorists point to myths of giants as more than allegory. The Bible speaks of the Nephilim, offspring of divine beings and mortals, roaming the earth before the Great Flood. Greek mythology recalls the Titans, who shaped mountains and warred with the gods. Norse sagas recount the Jötnar, colossal adversaries who lived on the edges of the world. Native American tribes tell of red-haired giants that towered above their ancestors, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as predators. Could these disparate traditions preserve memories of a population, taller, stronger, perhaps endowed with abilities we cannot measure, that once formed the backbone of Tartaria? In the 19th century, newspapers brimmed with reports of giant skeletons. In the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, farmers ploughing fields unearthed skeletons 7 to 9 feet tall, often within burial mounds. Some were said to have skulls with double rows of teeth. In Wisconsin, archaeologists documented oversized remains during mound excavations. In Nevada's Lovelock Cave, guano miners in the early 1900s reported giant skeletons with red hair, aligning eerily with Paiute legends of the Site-Ka, a tribe of violent, cannibalistic giants. These stories spread quickly, only to fade, as remains disappeared into museum basements or private collections. The Smithsonian Institution, accused of suppressing such evidence, denies ever receiving them. Yet the consistency of reports, always large skeletons, always quietly removed, keeps the whispers alive. Artifacts, too, fuel suspicion. Oversized suits of armour preserved in European castles suggest warriors of immense stature. At least one sword in France measures over 7 feet long, dismissed as ceremonial, yet so well balanced it seems made for combat. Massive sarcophagi in Egypt, cut from single blocks of granite weighing over 70 tons, appear more practical for beings larger than humans today. Even architectural features, doorways towering 15 feet, staircases with risers too tall for comfort, suggest scale mismatched to our proportions. Were these anomalies design choices, or faint fingerprints of giants who once strode across Tartaria? Modern science complicates the picture. Genetic evidence shows many populations, especially in Asia and Oceania, carry Denisovan DNA. This lineage seems to have conferred unusual traits: enhanced oxygen use in Tibetans, stronger immune responses in Melanesians. Some theorists propose Denisovans were physically larger than modern humans, leaving echoes in our biology and myths alike. If Tartaria's people were descended from or intermixed with Denisovans, perhaps their stature, strength, and perception made them appear to later cultures as gods or giants. Consider the possibility of hybridization. What if Tartarian giants were not anomalies but a population resulting from unions between Homo sapiens and archaic lineages? The Bible's Nephilim, sons of God, mingling with daughters of men, could be a poetic memory of such genetic crossings. The resulting hybrids might have inherited not only size, but cognitive or sensory abilities we no longer possess, heightened awareness, natural resonance with sound, even the capacity to manipulate energy. Legends support this. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, sky beings who descended to shape civilization. The Greeks believed the Titans taught humanity crafts before being overthrown. Native traditions often describe giants as both destructive and wise, therefore marking a rupture between past and present. If Tartaria was their last flowering, its erasure could be seen as the deliberate severing of a bloodline that once carried extraordinary gifts. Skeptics counter that gigantism is a known medical condition, not evidence of a population. Tall skeletons, they argue, were mismeasured or exaggerated. Reports in old newspapers fed a sensationalist appetite for marvels. Double rows of teeth could be developmental anomalies, not a distinct species. DNA evidence, they remind us, shows admixture with Neanderthals and Denisovans, but no trace of giants. To mainstream science, the Nephilim, Titans, and Jotnar remain metaphors, not ancestors. And yet the convergence of myth, artifact, and anomaly leaves an opening. Why do cultures across oceans all remember giants? Why do so many burial mounds, cairns, and stone chambers hold stories of oversized inhabitants? Why do architectural remains suggest spaces that fit bodies larger than ours? Even if literal giants never walked the earth, the myths might encode memory of people different enough, taller, stronger, more attuned to forces we can't perceive, that they became larger than life in legend. Imagine taking a modern DNA test, sending off a vial of saliva, and weeks later receiving your results. Pie charts break down your ancestry, percentages of Neanderthal, fragments of Denisovan. But what if the test revealed something stranger? A fragment labelled unknown archaic, a lineage that doesn't fit established categories. Would you dismiss it as error, or wonder if it is a genetic whisper of Tartaria's giants still flowing in your blood? In the end, DNA holds both promise and frustration. It proves that humanity is not singular, that we carry within us traces of unions with others who no longer walk the earth. But it also conceals, for the deeper we look, the more ghost lineages appear, hinting at chapters still missing. Perhaps Tartaria is one of those chapters, not yet written in textbooks, but still encoded in myth, stone, and the marrow of our bones. If so, the question is not only scientific but existential. What would it mean if giants once built our cities, sang our stones into place, and left behind echoes in our blood? Would we see ourselves as heirs to greatness, or as orphans of a lineage too vast to comprehend? The answers remain hidden, elusive. But to pursue them is to confront the silence that follows whenever we stumble upon the impossible. And it is that silence we now enter, as we turn from myth and anomaly to the voices of those who deny it all. The skeptics who insist Tartaria was never an empire, and its giants never more than shadows in the imagination. Not everyone sees Tartaria as a lost empire. For many historians and archaeologists, the very idea is a mirage, stitched together from misunderstood maps, misread buildings, and modern conspiratorial imagination. To understand the weight of the mystery, we must also sit with the skeptics, for their voices sharpen the questions that remain. The academic explanation begins with the word itself. Tartaria, they argue, was never the name of a unified civilization. Instead, it was a cartographic convenience, a label used by European mapmakers from the 13th to 18th centuries to denote vast and little-known regions of Asia. Much as old maps depicted California as an island or filled seas with sea monsters, Tartaria was a placeholder for lands Europeans had yet to explore fully. Over time, as Russian, Chinese, and Central Asian borders solidified, the vague name faded from atlases. The disappearance was not erasure, they say, but the natural evolution of geography. The Russian Geographical Society points to detailed maps from the 1700s onward that show Tartary subdivided into Khanates, Siberian territories, and nomadic regions. In this view, there was no single Tartarian empire, only a misunderstanding of diverse peoples, Turks, Mongols, Tatars, bundled under one label. When Russia annexed Siberia, the term simply fell out of use. And what of the mud flood? To geologists, the buried buildings of Seattle, Moscow, or Paris have mundane explanations. Cities are living organisms. They grow atop their own ruins. Streets are raised to improve drainage, to fight fires, to install sanitation. In Seattle, engineers deliberately lifted sidewalks after floods, leaving older storefronts as underground relics. In Paris, centuries of rubble raised street levels. Edinburgh's vaults were sealed not by cataclysm, but by construction. What looks like catastrophe, they argue, is merely the sediment of urban life. The giants too, skeptics say, collapse under scrutiny. 19th century newspaper articles thrived on sensationalism, printing tales of giants alongside stories of sea serpents and Martian canals. Bones said to measure 9 feet often turned out to be mastodon femurs or hoaxes crafted to sell papers. The Smithsonian denies suppressing skeletons, insisting no credible evidence of giant humans exists. To evolutionary biology, gigantism is a rare condition, not a race. Even the world's fairs, beloved by Tartarian theorists as showcases of inherited architecture, are explained away. The ornate palaces of Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition were built quickly from staff, a plaster mixture intended to dazzle temporarily. Photographs show scaffolding, workers, and construction in progress. Their demolition was practical. Plaster crumbles, fires spread, land was repurposed. The emptiness of some photos is attributed to long exposure times, where moving crowds vanished like ghosts. And yet, the skeptics' answers raise their own questions. If Tartaria was merely a label, why did maps from rival nations agree so consistently on its boundaries? If buried buildings are simply urban evolution, why does the pattern of 10 to 20 foot submergence appear across continents at the same historical moment? If giants are myth, why do cultures separated by oceans all tell the same stories of colossal beings shaping the world? Perhaps the truth lies between poles. Maybe Tartaria was not a centralized empire, but neither was it pure invention. Maybe the maps, the ruins, the myths, and the DNA fragments all point not to one lost civilization, but to many layers of forgotten pasts, woven together by those seeking meaning in silence. For even when skeptics dismantle the grand narrative, anomalies remain, architectural echoes, unexplained energies, whispers in stone and soil, and it is these echoes we turn to next, as we listen not to maps or bones, but to the resonance still alive in ruins, where voices seem to linger long after their builders are gone. I touched the stone, and the air began to hum. This testimony, whispered by a visitor to the Bosnian pyramids, captures the essence of a mystery that refuses to fade. Even when skeptics dismiss Tartaria as mislabeling and myth, the ruins themselves seem to vibrate with memory, as if the stones remember. Across the world, sites associated with the Tartarian aesthetic, domes, arches, star forts, exhibit anomalies. At the Bosnian pyramids, researchers have recorded electromagnetic surges during solar storms. Tourists describe sensations of warmth, vivid dreams, or inexplicable clarity after descending into the tunnels. In Scotland's vitrified forts, where stone walls appear melted by heat beyond ordinary fire, visitors report hearing faint tones carried on the wind, as though the rock itself resonates. Could these be mere coincidences, tricks of geology and imagination? Or are they psychic remnants, vibrational imprints left behind by a civilization that mastered resonance? The idea is not as far-fetched as it seems. In Malta's hypogeum, tones in the low-frequency range alter human brain waves. In Peru, stones at Ollantaytambo fit so precisely that tapping them produces bell-like sounds. Modern science calls this archaeoacoustics, the study of how ancient sites shape sound. What if Tartarian architecture was part of the same lineage, designed not only for strength, but for harmony? Legends echo this possibility. Siberian shamans speak of places where the earth sings, portals to other realms. Russian folktales describe crystal palaces that rang with tones capable of healing. Even in the American Midwest, settlers recorded indigenous traditions of mounds that hummed under the moon. Might these be fragments of the same knowledge, a global memory of structures alive with frequency? Skeptics reduce such experiences to acoustics, placebo, or suggestion. Yet the consistency of reports across cultures is striking. Visitors describe similar sensations: warmth without heat, sound without source, visions arriving in dreams. What if resonance is a kind of archive, a way for the past to imprint itself on matter? If Tartaria harnessed this, perhaps their legacy endures not in ruins alone, but in the vibrations those ruins still emit. Picture standing in an empty cathedral at dusk. A single note, hummed softly, grows until the entire hall sings back to you, as if the building itself were alive. For a moment, you are no longer alone. You are joined by the ghost of its builders, not in body, but in resonance. Perhaps this is Tartaria's true survival, not in maps or monuments, but in frequencies woven into stone, waiting for those attuned to listen. And so we approach the final threshold. We have traced maps, mud, giants, airships, star forts, floods, and echoes. Yet no definitive answer has emerged. What remains is a question lingering in the silence. What if Tartaria was the lost civilization erased from history? To close our journey, we step into reflection, into the quiet space where memory and forgetting blur, the threshold of time itself. Dawn settles across the steppes of Siberia. The mist rolls low, curling through grasses that stretch to the horizon. Once maps declared this land Great Tartary, its name written in bold letters across half a continent. Now it is empty of empires, its silence broken only by the wind. To look upon it today is to stand at the threshold of memory, where history frays into myth. We began with maps, ink on parchment whispering of a vanished dominion. We walked through mud-flooded streets and subterranean chambers, glimpsed giants in forgotten legends, heard the hum of stone and the silence of demolished cities. Each fragment offered a piece of the puzzle, yet none completed it. Was Tartaria a real civilization, advanced beyond what we imagine, buried by cataclysm and erased by decree? Or was it a name, a mirror reflecting our yearning for a forgotten golden age? The evidence remains unresolved. Maps show what no longer exists. Buried architecture suggests resets, yet geology offers other answers. Skeletons of giants vanish into rumour, but DNA carries traces of lost populations. Cathedrals resonate with impossible acoustics, yet science explains echoes with mathematics. Each thread we follow splits, doubling back, weaving myth and fact until they are inseparable. And perhaps that is Tartaria's true legacy, not as a definitive empire, but as a reminder that history is never secure. Time folds. Civilizations rise, collapse, and vanish, leaving descendants to wonder whether progress is ascent or return. If we are, as Graham Hancock warns, a species with amnesia, Tartaria is the name we give to the hole in our memory. Even so, the silence of erasure is not absolute. Walk through a forgotten star fort at twilight, and the angles still hum with unseen energy. Enter a cathedral alone, and the vaulted air sings back your voice. Study old maps, and the bold word Tartaria stares defiantly across continents, refusing to be erased. These are not ruins, they are reminders. So we end where we began, with a name that once filled the world and now lingers only in whispers. Was Tartaria real? Was it erased? The answer lies not in certainty, but in curiosity. For as long as we keep asking, the silence breaks, and the forgotten empire lives again, if only in imagination. Before you drift into sleep, I invite you to carry that question with you. Perhaps tomorrow, when you walk down a city street or stand before an old building, you'll glance at a doorway too tall, a window too low, and wonder, what if this is Tartaria, still here, hiding in plain sight? And if these mysteries intrigue you, consider subscribing so that together we can keep searching the shadows of history. Where are you listening from tonight, and at what time? I'd love to know how far these echoes travel. Good night.